Yes.
Good morning, sir. I'm going to pick up where we left off at the end of last week with Dr. Lane's fifth draft proof of evidence prepared as part of the HIV haemophilia litigation. Sally, could we have on screen, please, CBLA 605_002? And if we could go to page 175. This is the beginning of the second main topic addressed by Dr. Lane in his draft proof of evidence. So self-sufficiency and domestic production was the issue which we looked at on Friday. In this part of his statement, he begins to address the question of hepatitis risks and other viral infections. If we turn to page 180, we'll see the overview that Dr. Lane gave, and I'll just want to read through a handful of these paragraphs by way of introduction of the topic. So paragraph 423, Dr. Lane says this: the problem of the transmission of hepatitis B to haemophiliacs treated with concentrate manufactured from pools of plasma which included infected donations was certainly one which was appreciated throughout the 1970s. That said, it was not a condition which resulted, save in relatively few cases, as I've mentioned above, in fatalities amongst those infected with the virus. The likely outcome of infection in haemophiliacs was the development of antibodies to the hepatitis B virus, providing immunity against repeat infection. Although, as I described below, the problem of hepatitis B transmission through blood products gave rise to a consideration of manufacturing products from small pools of plasma, there were, in the case of hepatitis B, a number of reasons why this approach was not adopted. And then we can see he sets out a range of reasons. The first is that RTCs tested donations for the hepatitis B antigen using tests of increasing sensitivity as these became available. Just pausing there, at various points in this section of his statement, Dr. Lane talks about the hepatitis B RIA test that was introduced at BPL. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you'll find it a useful source of information relating to the BPL's test itself. Second point he puts forward for not adopting a smaller pool approach is that the level of usage of products amongst severe haemophiliacs was such that by the end of the 1970s, those who'd received treatment had at one time or another become infected with hepatitis B and had in the vast majority of cases satisfactorily recovered. And then the third point is the development of the vaccine, although as we see at the top of the next page, he goes on to say that that vaccine was not generally available until 1984. Picking it up then at 427, he says the approach to the control of transmission of hepatitis B was through the effective screening of blood donations and latterly through active immunisation of recipients at risk. The incidence of hepatitis B transmission was substantially reduced by these approaches, thereby indicating their efficacy. The problem with non-A, non-B hepatitis and later HIV represented different challenges for reasons which are considered below. And then he goes on to consider non-A, non-B hepatitis in the following terms. Paragraph 428, he refers to, from 1975 onwards, increasing control of hepatitis B, revealing patients suffering from a form of hepatitis referred to as non-A, non-B. And he says this in the last sentence in paragraph 428, it is now known that the acute infection in many patients was subclinical or asymptomatic and at the time in question went unnoticed. And then if we go to paragraph 430, bottom of the page, having referred to some research...
Difficult to say that something went unnoticed if earlier on in the same paragraph you say it was revealed.
Yes, well, I think he's saying that there was, I suppose it may be saying he's saying in many patients it was subclinical or asymptomatic, but you're right, so there's a tension there potentially. Paragraph 430, he then says this research also showed, excuse me, that the long-term effects of non-A, non-B hepatitis were far more serious than had at first been appreciated. Fatalities were rare, but the infection clearly resulted in subacute or chronic liver disease. The difficulty in testing hepatitis non-A, non-B was due to the absence of marker tests available at the time, and then he refers to the licensing of a test for hepatitis C. What's not entirely clear, certainly from this paragraph, but from reading the witness statement as a whole, is precisely when Dr. Lane says he appreciated that non-A, non-B had serious long-term effects or gave rise to chronic liver disease. And we'll see in a few minutes, in the same way as the first part of his statement goes document by document through the years, he does the same in relation to hepatitis B. But for example, in 1978, the section of his proof on 1978, there is no reference to the research by Dr. Preston. And again, as I indicated on Friday, we don't know the basis on which particular documents were put to Dr. Lane for comment, save that they were documents in the CBLA's discovery list. If we go over the page, top of page 431, he says, sorry, top of paragraph 431, top of page 182, because of the difficulties referred to above, fractionators began to consider ways of inactivating the non-A, non-B hepatitis virus in the production process. This work was underway at the time when it was accepted that a new virus, HIV, might be present in plasma pools and be transmissible in finished products. In the absence of early information on HIV, it had to be assumed that the virus inactivation process being devised for non-A, non-B hepatitis would be equally applicable to the virus associated with AIDS cases. Paragraph 432, the plaintiff's claim presupposes that heat treatment was something which should have been embraced to deal with hepatitis and other unspecified viruses much earlier than in fact was the case. However, hepatitis B, for the reasons given above, was controlled by donor screening and patient immunisation. And so pausing there, it appears to be Dr. Lane's thesis that earlier investigation of heat treatment was not warranted by reason of the risk of hepatitis B because there were other methods of addressing hepatitis B, although patient immunisation, as we've seen, didn't become prevalent according to his own proof of evidence until 1984. So it doesn't necessarily quite fit with what he's saying.
Well, it's not. It can't be a reason.
No.
It's an excuse rather than a reason.
And then he continues, only when it became apparent that non-A, non-B hepatitis could carry serious long-term sequelae was it necessary to give consideration to a virus inactivation process that did not compromise the safety or efficacy of the products in question. In respect of non-A, non-B hepatitis, further thought was given to using small plasma pools to supply products to haemophiliacs who needed only occasional treatment. In a trial of small pool product, this procedure alone failed to prevent non-A, non-B hepatitis transmission. That, I think, is referring to the same matter as Dr. Smith, the use at Oxford of the green 4 plasmapheresis donations. But it's not entirely clear because, although it's referred to in a number of occasions elsewhere, Dr. Lane doesn't use the same terminology as Dr. Smith uses to describe it, so it's not entirely clear, but it may be that that's what he's referring to there. And in any event, you'll see the reason that's given for non-A, non-B hepatitis not being a trigger for earlier consideration of heat treatment than it was is that it wasn't apparent that it could carry serious long-term sequelae. And obviously that's a matter which you will need to give full consideration to in due course.
Yes.
Paragraph. Sorry, sir.
Yes, and it's also saying that although hepatitis B could kill, it didn't do it often enough to justify there being any particular measure taken against it by researching into what might get rid of it.
That's certainly one reading of the way in which Dr. Lane addresses this issue.
Yes.
And then paragraph 433, he says, against this background, heat treatment along with other methods of virus inactivation had to be reviewed and researched. However, it must be understood that fractionators must exercise care when making changes to their processes. Any change in the manufacturing process can lead to changes in the product itself, which may deprive it of some or all of its effectiveness or give rise to the possibility of adverse reactions, side effects, etc. Significant process variations require that full clinical evaluation of the product confirms product safety and efficacy in line with regulatory requirements. And then top of the next page, 434, without due clinical evaluation, clinicians are unlikely to use a new or modified product. In relation to NHS heat-treated concentrate, when it became available for trial in 1984, and that, again, I take to be a reference to that which Dr. Smith described in his evidence, in other words, the earlier availability of some dry-heated HCRV. Even with preliminary knowledge of HIV, there were clear differences in clinical opinion concerning its use. The balance of judgment lay between the unproven efficacy of the heat treatment process in virus inactivation on the one hand and potential protein denaturation and increased immunogenicity on the other hand. And then this, finally, by way of overview in the next paragraph, he says this: prior to a chronological review of the developments in relation to hepatitis B, hepatitis non-A, non-B, and then HIV, which is what the draft proof of evidence then purports to provide. The risk-benefit analysis by patients and their clinicians applicable to the use of factor 8 and 9 concentrates and the impact of HIV on this analysis must be reviewed. Hepatitis B proved fatal in relatively few cases and was an ever-reducing risk through the 1970s for the reasons given above. Although hepatitis B and non-A, non-B infection was universally recognised during the 1970s, and even when the longer-term sequelae of non-A, non-B hepatitis became apparent, the steady significant increase in patient demand for factors 8 and 9 from any source indicated that the benefit to patients from control of bleeding exceeded the perceived risk or discomfort from hepatitis infection. You may wish to reflect there, sir, on the way in which the consequences of hepatitis are there described. And of course, the question of perceived risk depends in part upon what information is being given to patients, if any, to enable them to assess risk. It's a slightly curiously worded sentence.
It is. It's plainly looking at the 1970s because the next sentence starts off by 1980. And so he appears to be saying that both hepatitis B and non-A, non-B were recognised universally in the 1970s, and the longer-term sequelae of non-A, non-B hepatitis, although he doesn't himself set a date for his own knowledge, he seems to accept that that became apparent in the 1970s. He's then saying, because there's an increase in patient demand, the benefit exceeds the perceived risk.
Yes.
Is he comparing apples and pears?
Yes, potentially, sir, yes. And that may be a matter for submission from
it's obviously a matter for submission, and it's not one for making conclusions on the hoof. But it is, as you say, it looks as though it may well be apples and pears, and it's a curious sentence.
It is. It then continues, by 1980, haemophiliacs could look forward to normalisation of their lives in terms of usefulness, quality and longevity. The intervention of HIV infection dramatically changed the balance. The product which saved life itself assumed the trappings of a death sentence, an invidious choice. So that's the overview. If we go over the page, you will see that there's then a heading, hepatitis B and hepatitis non-A, non-B, 1973 to 1985, the detail. And as I've indicated, there's then, as per the earlier section of the draft proof, a heading of a year, and then Dr. Lane comments on various documents that were produced in the course of that year. But it's far from comprehensive, and in fairness to Dr. Lane, he never suggests that it's intended as a comprehensive overview. Most of the documents that he refers to are ones that we have looked at before, either in presentations or with witnesses. So I am not, for the most part, going to go through the documents that he refers to, or indeed the passages in his draft proof of evidence. There's a handful I'll take you to. It may be more instructive at some stage for us to draw out really an assessment or a list of what's not referred to by Dr. Lane. So if we go to page 192, please, Sally. This is 1976. I've just asked you to note, sir, paragraph 452 refers to the RIA hepatitis B test available at BPL from January 1976. Dr. Lane says that's more sensitive than the tests then currently in use at regional transfusion centres, and we've seen that in a number of regional transfusion centres, the RIA test was not introduced at this stage, but over the following years. And again, that may be a matter upon which you hear submissions in due course. Paragraph 453, bottom of the page. Dr. Lane refers to a document produced by Dr. Smith in late 1976 comparing cryoprecipitate and intermediate purity concentrate. Again, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but we can just see the bottom of this page, top of the next, Dr. Lane's own comment. Dr. Lane says, in general terms, the paper discusses the benefit of purity at a time when the future use of cryoprecipitate was subject to considerable discussion. In my view, Dr. Smith's paper is a clear statement of common sense backed up by fact. And then he goes on to refer to various observations in Dr. Smith's paper about cryoprecipitate not competing with concentrate in safety, reliability or convenience for the patient. Now, obviously in relation to reliability and convenience, we've heard a number of expressions of views about advantages of concentrate over cryoprecipitate. The reference to safety itself begs a number of questions, not least in relation to risk of transmission of hepatitis. But that's Dr. Lane's observation in any event on that issue. If we then turn, please, Sully, to page 198. This is, if we go towards the bottom of the page, this is part of Dr. Lane's commentary on materials published in 1977, and he's commenting here upon a paper published by Dr. Krask and Dr. Kirk, which we've looked at elsewhere. I draw your attention to paragraph 465 because this again is Dr. Lane's own comments rather than just his summary of the documents. So he says, picking it up in the third line, this early work supported what I believe was in fact the case, i.e. that US commercial concentrate was more likely to be infected with hepatitis B, having regard to the fact that the plasma from which it was manufactured was obtained from paid donors. The social status of these donors was such that they were more at risk of contracting hepatitis B than volunteer donors, although even in the UK there was a higher incidence of virus carriers in the main metropolitan areas. A non-reactive result with the most sensitive hepatitis B test will not exclude all infectious plasma. Therefore, an intrinsically higher incidence of hepatitis B carrier donors in the total donor population places an added risk of infection into large plasma pools. And then I don't propose to put it on the screen, but I ask you to note, and indeed those listening, paragraph 469 also deals with Dr. Lane's support for RIA testing in relation to hepatitis B. If we move over to page 202, please. So you will see this is the section of the statement dealing with 1978. Again, there is quite a significant discussion of hepatitis B testing and the RIA test available at BPL. If we then, I don't think we need to look at it, but it's paragraphs 472 to 475, which deal with that. If we go on to page 207, this is a general observation from Dr. Lane. at paragraph 483, talking about 1978, it's also clear from the material in 1978 that there was a better understanding of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And he says that can be seen from an undated document in the form of a report prepared by Dr. Krask, summarising the work of the Haemophilia Centre Director's Hepatitis Working Party 1978. And he observes that dealt with the incidence of hepatitis from haemophil and incidence of multiple attacks of hepatitis, indicating the existence of two types of non-A, non-B hepatitis. I'm not going to show that document on screen. Again, we've looked at it in earlier hearings. But for the transcript, the reference to the Working Party report is... No, I've written down the wrong reference. I'm sorry. I'll find that and supplement that later. The other point in relation to 1978, as I indicated, the various documents that are commented on do not include any description of Dr. Preston's work, which, as you know, others have indicated was a significant turning point. If we go over the page to page 208, we get to 1979, and you'll see at the bottom of the page 486, again, it appears to be the report of the Hepatitis Working Party of the Haemophilia Centre Directors that Dr. Lane regards as particularly significant. We should have that, I think, if we go to HCDO, 40s135_023, please. So this is the 1979 report. And if we go, I think it's to pages 5, please. Yes, again, the report itself probably ought to be read in full. If we just go back to the previous page, we can see the heading. It's relationship of hepatitis to different brands of concentrate. And then there's a discussion which continues if we go over the page to page 5. We can pick it up perhaps in the second paragraph. Analysis of cases coming to operation in the past 18 months at Oxford shows that prior treatment with concentrate was the main factor which was associated with freedom from non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then there's reference to number of patients with severe haemophilia, only one reported as contracting non-A, non-B hepatitis, and then a much smaller number with mild haemophilia, producing a greater number of cases of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then under the heading mortality, we can see reference to no further fatalities directly due to acute hepatitis have been reported. One patient had acute non-A, non-B hepatitis followed by persistent raised enzyme levels in 1978. Died of a retroperitoneal hemorrhage, post-mortem refused, possible the hepatitis indirectly contributed to his death. And then there's reference to another patient found on post-mortem to have portal cirrhosis. And the report continues, we'll be interested in any further cases where specimens of post-mortem liver can be obtained from haemophiliacs to collect further evidence of prevalence of chronic liver disease. And then the discussion continues over the page. I'm not going to read through it. If we just go over the page briefly. There are then further matters set out in relation to identification of transaminitis and jaundice. So that's the document that Dr. Lane alights on in relation to 1979 as being the most interesting document produced, he says, during that year. If we go back to the witness statement, please, CBLA 605_002. Yep, CBLA 605_002. And we go to page 212. This is now 1980, and just draw attention to paragraph 499. says, although BPL had been represented by Dr. Drummond Ellis on the Haemophilia Centre Directors Hepatitis Working Party, we see Dr. Lane saying he'd like to represent BPL personally on the Working Party, as hepatitis was clearly going to be a major problem area for some years to come. So that's Dr. Lane's reason put forward in April 1980 for wanting to participate in the Hepatitis Working Party, and he did indeed attend Hepatitis Working Party meetings after that.
Just give me a moment. And this is in 1980?
1st of April 1980. But I think I should also read paragraph 500. He refers to there being a meeting of the Hepatitis Working Party July 1980. And he was commenting on the basis of having the agenda, but not any further documents relating to it. So what is then set out is Dr. Lane's comment. He says this: as a result of studies carried out by Dr. Krask and others, clinicians now know that hepatitis non-A, non-B was responsible for and if we go to the top of the next page, please. Acute and chronic hepatitis in a significant percentage of cases. This is a condition which took time to establish itself, and its gestation period was roughly comparable to the period during which factor VIII concentrate began to be used more widely. The clinical concern now evident concerning non-A, non-B hepatitis became the catalyst for BPL to direct research into viral inactivation. And indeed, we can then see that picked up in the next paragraph where he says, in the latter part of 1980, I consulted with senior staff of BPL on procedures available for inactivation of non-A, non-B hepatitis virus. And we looked at some of those in the context of Dr. Smith's evidence last week. So it would appear from this that Dr. Lane is saying by 1980, hepatitis, and I think he's clearly referring here to non-A, non-B hepatitis, was something regarded by him as sufficiently significant for him to want to be directly involved in the work of the Hepatitis Working Party and to trigger at least a degree of thinking about commencing work on viral inactivation.
Yes, and he doesn't regard it as necessarily his own particular concern. He's expressing it as being the concern generally.
Yes. And we can pick up further on that theme on page 218. Paragraph 509, where Dr. Lane refers to there having been numerous requests to the Department of Health for advice on diverse problems regarding viral hepatitis B and non-A, non-B, and requests to set up a body, and then it refers to a decision by the department to set up a body called the Hepatitis Advisory Group, which was to meet for the first time in October 1980. The Department of Health envisaged the main committee would depend on a subcommittee to advise it on technical aspects of tests for viral hepatitis. There's reference to the terms of reference for the Hepatitis Advisory Group, and then Dr. Lane tells us that he became a member of the Hepatitis Advisory Group. And then bottom of the page refers to pool sizes. Dr. Lane says that became something of a focus of attention in the coming months. And he refers to a memorandum.
Does that relate, if you could go back to the previous page, he refers to a publication by, or advice from Professor Zuckerman.
That's page 213. If we can go to that, please, Sally.
I noticed this in passing. It's the second point. And indeed the third point.
Pooling of a large number of units of plasma for preparation of plasma derivatives increased the risk of contaminating the pool with an infectious unit. Yes.
And then the WHO Expert Committee on Viral
Yeah.
Hepatitis.
Yes.
Just can we go over the page and see how that finishes? Yes. Yes.
So if we then go on to page 218, the bottom of the page refers to, again, so to pool sizes, to Dr. Smith being sent a memorandum by Dr. Lane 29th of September. If we can just look at that memorandum, it should, Sally, be at CBLA 0001173. Yes. So this is Dr. Lane to Dr. Smith, 29th of September 1980, in response to a memo from Dr. Smith. And Dr. Lane says this: I see no reason why the limit on donations per batch should not be lifted, enabling us to process 900 to 1,000 kilograms of some plasmas on some days. In connection with the risk of transmission of hepatitis, I am sure that once one has exceeded the 100 to 200 kilogram pool size, one has already exceeded any possibility of small pool protection. I have discussed this with John Crask recently, and he agrees exactly on this point. So it would appear a decision to increase pool sizes on the basis, as it were, of being past the point of no return, in one sense, is arguably what's being set out here.
Yes.
Dr. Lane comments on this memorandum in his statement. So if we go back to the draft proof of evidence, Sally, CBLA 605_002, page 219. Paragraph 511, he says the conclusion was based on the belief that the non-A, non-B virus carrier rate in donors approximated to 1%, and that 100 kilograms of plasma would comprise inputs from a minimum of 200 donors. He then, in paragraph 512, goes on to set out a number of reasons from what he describes as a fractionator's point of view for favouring large pools to small ones from what he describes as a manufacturing standpoint. 4 reasons given in this paragraph. The first is economy of scale, which this brings to the production process. Second, he says very small pools do not provide enough product for severe haemophiliacs, who would very quickly exhaust factor 8 or 9 concentrate produced in such a way, requiring product from another pool, thereby defeating the object of a small pool approach. Thirdly, the administrative aspects of establishing and running small pools on any scale would be quite disproportionate to the amount of product such methods could produce. Fourthly, large pools have the effect of producing a more standardised and more predictable product in terms of quality. And so that's Dr. Lane's perspective on the manufacturing advantages and fractionation advantages of large pools over small pools. If we then move to page 226, please. So we're now in 1981, and we looked at this in the course of Mr. Hill's presentation last week, and I referred to it in the course of the presentation on Dr. Smith's evidence. But in February 1981, there was the proposal for that BPL should look at methods of virus inactivation, and we can see that picked up in paragraph 527. And 528. And we can see from the extract set out in paragraph 528, the reason for this is because of non-A, non-B hepatitis. So there's reference to the reduction in the incidence of hepatitis B, but that the importance of non-A, non-B hepatitis is an undesirable side effect of transfusion of blood and blood products. Some evidence that the risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis is greater for imported blood products, but then continues that the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis following infusion of NHS concentrates is still a cause for concern. And so that is the beginning of the process that we explored in the presentations last week. Paragraph 529 then picks up by reference to the consideration of that proposal at a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee. I'm not going to go through that again because we've, I think, looked at the most significant documents in that regard. If we just go over the page, however, to page 228 and pick up paragraph 531, this returns to the issue of hepatitis B screening and the availability of the BPL-RIA test. Dr. Lane is here referring to an article he wrote, published in the journal Medical Laboratory Sciences. And he describes the purpose of the article to bring to everyone's attention the fact that BPL had developed in-house an RIA test for the detection of hepatitis B, which he describes as inexpensive and with a sensitivity at least equal to that of the best commercial preparations. We don't need to display the article itself. For the transcript, the reference is CBLA 301310. But if we go to the next page, I just want to draw attention to one paragraph in the article, which is set out in the draft proof. It's the second paragraph on the page, where Dr. Lane says, and it's the top of what's visible on the screen, the pooling of plasma has always caused concern at the BPL, since the single plasma donation negative by HA at the 20 ng per ml level would probably be missed by RIA when pooled with 25 other donations. Without doubt, hepatitis B surface antigen has been missed in the past for this reason, and positive donations incorporated into pools for fractionation. If we then move to 1982, page 238, please.
So is he just going back to that for a moment? Is the subtext of that if the test on a single plasma donation had initially been done by RIA, there would have been enough virus in the sample to be picked up by RIA and the single donation shown to be positive. If, however, you pool it with 25 other donations, which are not themselves positive, that dilutes the titer of the virus so that even the RIA doesn't pick that up.
That was my reading of the paragraph, yes.
So it's really saying we need to extend RIA testing to all the sources.
Yes. He explains, if we just go back to the previous page, sorry, it's always a danger of trying to take things too quickly. Sorry, page 228, previous page. Yep, so the bottom of the page has is where the extract from the article begins. And he picks it up really at the picture in 1978. Only 3 centres using the RIA method, 3 regional transfusion centres. And then he refers to work at the North London Blood Transfusion Centre.
And what does that go on to say?
I'm sorry?
What does that go on to say? Just in general terms?
Yes, so in general terms, 1 in 600 positive reactions accrued when testing new blood donors, whilst with regular donors the incidence lengthened to 1 in 12,000 or more. Using RIA on the regular donors was not expected to turn up a positive test missed by hemagglutination more than perhaps once in 5 to 10 years. So he is, I think, comparing the relative risks, I suppose, from the perspective of the blood transfusion centre as opposed to BPL, where pooling is taking place, for the very reason that you summarised by reference to the next paragraph, sir.
Yes, thank you.
So if we then move to 1982, page 238, you will see the first paragraph on the page 549 refers to an increase in pool sizes January 1982 to the equivalent of 7,500 donations per pool, and consent being given for that increase. And then we can see in paragraph 550 the theme of working parties, bodies looking at the hepatitis non-A, non-B hepatitis is picked up in paragraph 550. Just over halfway down the paragraph, Dr. Lane says, I supported the idea of a combined working party, and that was to look at post-transfusion hepatitis and statistics regarding non-A, non-B infection. Bottom of the next page, please. Paragraph 553, this is August 1982. Dr. Lane notes that the Hepatitis Working Party, so that's the UK HCDO Hepatitis Working Party, hadn't met for some 6 months. And then we get from Dr. Lane that Dr. Krask had written to him indicating that Dr. Krask had deliberately not called a meeting since the previous year because there was little further fresh information which required consideration. So it appears to be, the issue of non-A, non-B hepatitis not receiving active consideration from the Hepatitis Working Party for the reason they're given by Dr. Krask, at the same time as others seem to be suggesting it's a significant problem which does require discussion and cooperation. There's little else, I think, of note other than documents we've looked at in earlier hearings for 1982. If we then go to 1983, page 245, paragraph 569, this is the way Dr. Lane puts it, concentrating on developments with regards to hepatitis, one may perhaps get a somewhat false impression of the level of activity during the year, and that's looking to 1983. In truth, the issue of non-A, non-B hepatitis and what was to be done to our products to deal with it expeditiously was merged with the HIV issue, giving impetus to both ourselves and commercial fractionators in connection with research into virus inactivation. So really, just as Dr. Smith's evidence also explicitly stated, the work on viral inactivation was effectively given an impetus, given a greater degree of urgency because of the emergence of HIV. And then if we go, I'll just ask you to note, bottom of the page, paragraph 572, I'm not going to look at the document, but that's a paper produced by Dr. Lane in July 1983, largely concerned with AIDS. But you'll see that the comment that Dr. Lane records about it, the severity of hepatitis non-A, non-B, might result from impaired immune responsiveness. We'll pick up, obviously, 1983 again when we consider what Dr. Lane has to say about AIDS. In relation to 1984 and 1985, there's little of any particular note in Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence, because the issue of work on heat treatment in response to AIDS has largely now taken over. And then Dr. Lane's statement effectively comes to an end as at 1985. It doesn't contain any discussion of material post-dating 1985. If we then go to page 254, we'll see there's a summary of hepatitis claims and CBLA's rebuttal. So here again, we are reminded that this is a draft proof of evidence produced as a response to litigation and very much framed as the CBLA's reply to the specific allegations advanced by the plaintiffs in the HIV haemophilia litigation. And if we go to the bottom of the page, in response to the allegation that there was a failure to appreciate the seriousness of the risks of hepatitis, Dr. Lane's observation is that the CBLA effectively only became responsible on the 1st of December 82, which is, of course, as a matter of fact, correct. Hepatitis B was, to all intents and purposes, he says, controlled through RIA testing, by that time both at BPL and in RTCs. And then over the top of the next page, he observes that it was necessary, so far as CBLA were concerned, to concentrate on the management and control of non-A, non-B transmission. By the time CBLA became responsible for BPL/PFL, so by the 1st of December 1982, it had been established through the work of Dr. Krask and others that hepatitis non-A, non-B was a serious and widespread problem. And by 1983, that its transmission rate was similar in NHS and commercial concentrate, albeit that the US variety appeared to cause a more serious acute clinical disorder. So we don't get from Dr. Lane's proof the point in time at which he says, either from his perspective or BPL's perspective or more generally, a particular date by which it was recognised that non-A, non-B was a serious problem. But we do know that he says, well, that was well recognised by December 1982.
And it's well recognised or established, he says.
Well, yes, sorry, established, which goes further.
Yes, it suggests it's been recognised and well recognised for some time.
Yes.
It doesn't say how long a time that is.
And then he picks it up halfway through that paragraph. By the time CBLA became responsible for BPL and PFL, we were giving consideration to methods available for virus inactivation, which would assure the safety and efficacy of the product. CBLA supported this ongoing programme of work in two main respects. Firstly, develop a more highly purified factor VIII preparation, which would, secondly, accommodate virus inactivation procedures without undue loss of potency, efficacy or yield. This research was well underway by the time it became necessary to include HIV in the list of target viruses. And again, whether it can be said that the research was well underway by that time is no doubt a matter that you will wish to consider in due course. And then if we go over the page to 256, paragraph 602 returns to the topic of the small pool experiments and suggests, if we pick it up in the last two sentences of paragraph 602, he says, to achieve self-sufficiency, the logistics of small pool fractionation, the reduction in efficacy of process and of consistency and quality argued against the small pool approach, the answer is to have a successful heat inactivation procedure applicable to a product from any size of plasma pool. In short, small pools offered no guarantee of protection, would be quickly exhausted by the severe haemophiliacs, most of whom are the plaintiffs in the present proceedings, and given what was known about hepatitis non-A, non-B in the early 1980s, would not have justified the reorganisation necessary to change production to exclusively small pool. Now, there might be a tension there between that paragraph, in terms of what's said about non-A, non-B hepatitis, and the earlier paragraph, because that appears to be saying that in the early 1980s, non-A, non-B hepatitis was not regarded as sufficiently serious as to justify the use of small pool over large pool.
Yes, whereas on the 1st of April 1980, he was saying hepatitis is clearly going to be a major problem area for some years to come.
Of course, we know from the other passages I've taken you to that he had views about the feasibility of small pool production on a larger scale.
Yes.
For the reasons he set out in the statement. Dr. Lane's proof then goes on to look at AIDS. If we go to page 265, just going to ask you to note, sir, that the page numbers in Dr. Lane's statement are out of order at this point and a couple of other points in his statement. So we have disclosed the version in precisely the form in which we got it. But actually, there are some pages that are out of order. And so we get an overview in relation to AIDS on this page, which is page 265 of the electronic disclosed document. And you'll see it's page 264 of the internal pagination. We then have to go back to page 260 electronically, which is page 267 of the internal pagination, to see the review of the documents relating to AIDS, which Dr. Lane embarks upon. And I'm just going to, again, alight on a handful of references because the vast majority of the material he refers to is material that we've looked at elsewhere. And it's not a comprehensive or exhaustive account of relevant documents. 610 on this page, Dr. Lane says this: the earliest reference to AIDS in CBL's documentation is September 1982. He's not suggesting, well, he's not telling us what his earliest knowledge was, but indicating that's the earliest reference to AIDS in the documentation CBLA holds. And that's the Hepatitis Working Party meeting, September 1982. We've looked at that on a number of occasions. And the next paragraph, Dr. Lane then refers to the meeting of the Haemophilia Centre directors held that same day, which asked Dr. Krask to look into this problem. Again, we've looked at that on numerous occasions. Top of the next page, you'll see that Dr. Lane then identifies an article on the 24th of September 1982, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, entitled Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome Cause Still Elusive. And he observes that that article would have been routinely available to all scientific staff at BPL/PFML. He then explains that the article was, in his view, a very useful one. Partly retrospective, traces the history of AIDS from its early manifestations in about June 1981 up until the time the article was written. He then quotes various parts of the article. I don't propose to invite your attention to that. Over the page, he sets out some other quotes. Paragraph 617, he observes it will be seen from reading the article that there was much uncertainty at that time as to the cause of AIDS. But if we go to the next paragraph, the next page, paragraph 618, Dr. Lane observes as follows: in summary, therefore, as at September 1982, there was a growing body of knowledge about the extent and nature of secondary infection in AIDS patients, but little information as to a primary infectious etiology. And then this: we see an early implication for the blood supply as a source of transmissible infection. Dr. Lane then again sets out a number of documents which we've looked at on previous occasions. If we go to page 274, we can pick the picture up in 1983, where Dr. Lane refers to a meeting of the UK Working Party on Transfusion-Associated Hepatitis, 18th of January 1983, which he attended. We've looked at that elsewhere, so I don't propose to go through the detail of it. He refers also in the next paragraph, 626, to further discussion on the 19th of January at the meeting of the UK HCDO Hepatitis Working Party, where Dr. Krask provides an update. And then if we go over the page to page 276, we see at paragraph 628, Dr. Lane tells us that the question of AIDS came up for the first time within the CBLA at a meeting on the 23rd of March 1983. We looked at that, I think, last week. We certainly have looked at it at some stage. And you'll see Dr. Lane summarises Professor Bloom's suggestion that there should be a discussion about AIDS at a future meeting. And Dr. Gunston's going to report back to the CBLA in June about discussions within the Council of Europe's Committee on Blood Transfusion. So that's March 1983 for AIDS being formally discussed for the first time within the CBLA. And at the bottom of the page, we can see there a reference to a memorandum sent by Dr. Lane on the 24th of March 1983 perhaps we will look at that. It's CBLA 00016991. We have, I think, already looked at it. But it's, I think, probably the first significant communication by Dr. Lane on the topic of AIDS. So it's his memo of the 24th of March. You'll see he refers to what Professor Bloom had to say at the CBLA meeting in the first paragraph. And you'll note in the penultimate sentence of that paragraph the reference to the high mortality cases being a cause for concern and being a primary factor behind what is described as the American overreaction to the problem. And then there is reference in the third paragraph to concern about from patients, resistance against the use of imported American coagulation factor concentrates becoming apparent, likelihood that a return to cryoprecipitate as a desirable form of treatment may become irresistible, whether logical or not, and then a reference to the need for BPL to develop a policy. And that led to the meeting on the 18th of April, which we looked at during the presentation of Dr. Smith's evidence last week. If we go to page 278 of the draft proof of evidence, so back to CBLA 605_002, please, Sally, page 278. Paragraph 632, Dr. Lane sets out his thinking at the time of writing the memorandum. Picking it up in the second sentence, my memorandum was written against the background of an expectation on my part that as concern amongst haemophiliacs with regards to the AIDS risk heightened, there would come with that concern the likelihood of a return, albeit on a temporary basis, to the use of cryoprecipitate as a preferred method of treatment until the cause of AIDS was properly diagnosed and preventative measures put in place. Now, just pausing there, that's an explicit recognition of that which quite a lot of the documents that we've looked at and evidence that we've heard doesn't acknowledge. So the debate about reversion to cryoprecipitate often appears to take place on the basis that it would have been a long-term and therefore problematic. Dr. Lane was here recognising that if there was a return to cryoprecipitate, it probably would be on a temporary basis, pending the development of other preventative measures to address AIDS. And then he continues, this would clearly have important effects on BPL as far as our source material was concerned, i.e. plasma would be used to manufacture cryo at the RTCs and not sent to us for fractionating. It seemed to me against this background we needed to be thinking in terms of converting to the production of small pool freeze-dried cryoprecipitate to assist blood transfusion centres where they were out of practice or otherwise ill-equipped to revert to cryoprecipitate manufacture. We know, of course, that didn't happen, but that is what he said is part of his thinking. He makes clear in the next paragraph that this didn't happen and explains his perception of why. The anticipated pressure for a switch to the use of cryoprecipitate as a temporary expedient never happened. It was a matter for the haemophilia clinicians and, to an extent, the licensing authority, if it thought US concentrate unsafe, to direct this change. The facilities at BPL/PFL have thus never been used for the production of small pool cryoprecipitate. So Dr. Lane saying it was for the clinicians treating patients and or to an extent the Committee on the Safety of Medicine / Secretary of State for Health to take the lead if that policy were to be introduced. Not for BPL because BPL was not a producer of cryo. Dr. Lane then goes on to discuss the meeting that took place on the 18th of April. If we just go to the next page, we can see the discussion in his draft proof starts on paragraph 634 and continues over the page. I'm not going to go through it in detail because we've looked at the minutes last week, but if we just go to the next page, please. We pick it up, paragraph 637. Dr. Lane says this in the last two sentences, picking up upon what he said in paragraph 633. He says, however, to an extent, we were obliged to adopt a policy of wait and see We needed directions from the haemophilia clinicians and DOH before we could react to produce what was needed. On top of the next page, paragraph 639, he says, our conclusion was to wait and see with regard to AIDS is reflected in a note which I prepared for the CBLA 22nd of April. You'll see then the extract from the note refers to the production policy at BPL being wait and see. The reference to the note which Dr. Lane is there referring to, I won't go to it now, but it's CBLA 0001697. And then if we go to page 283, please. You'll see the observation that Dr. Lane makes in paragraph 644. He is here specifically commenting on a meeting of the Regional Transfusion Directors Working Party on Transfusion-Associated Hepatitis, where they weren't proposing to make changes at that stage to donor selection practices. But then we see Dr. Lane's more general observation in paragraph 644. This reflects the general view at the time, so we're now end of April 83, i.e. that there was still insufficient information on which to make informed decisions on the AIDS problem. From the CBLA standpoint, we were, of course, pressing on with our virus inactivation programme, which had begun life as our response to the problem of hepatitis non-A, non-B. The intervention of AIDS did not deflect us from this course, since we were already working on a programme which would simultaneously resolve the problem of HIV and non-A, non-B hepatitis. Information gathering on the cause and progress of AIDS was the only relevant and appropriate activity. And then there's a reference 645 again to the role of haemophilia clinicians. Dr. Lane says, since BPL has never determined the clinical choice of products used by haemophilia clinicians, BPL continued to prepare intermediate purity concentrates of factor VIII, so that's the HL product, and to develop a high purity heated concentrate, which is what became 8Y, in the absence of an alternative directive from either the market or from the DOH and the regulatory authority. So again, consistent with the earlier passages, Dr. Lane is there setting out BPL's position, carrying on with production, continuing with the viral inactivation research, in the absence of either clinicians or the Department of Health or the CSM giving any particular direction or setting any particular policy. Then I think if we go on to page 289, paragraph 661, you'll see there, again, this is an observation by Dr. Lane as opposed to a comment on a particular document. He says there may have been scope for limiting or avoiding the use of concentrates. For example, a mild haemophiliac might be treated with cryoprecipitate or simply have the operation he was due to undergo postponed while the AIDS risk existed. It was probable, is that, so it's obviously, should just be, I think, it was probable that, by this stage, severe haemophiliacs who had over recent years been treated with large quantities of factor VIII, much of it from commercial sources, were already infected with HIV. If I just, sorry, there's a reference, yes, sorry, can we just go back to page 286? Paragraph 651 refers to a memo prepared by Dr. Lane, 26th of July 1983. I'm not going to ask you to look at the memo. The reference for it, however, is CBLA 0001729. Dr. Lane summarises in his draft proof what he recorded there. and you'll see from paragraph 653, you'll say, he says, I recorded the view current at that time, so July 83, that the AIDS syndrome was likely to include in its etiology an infective virus. So that's his own view at that time. He then sets out the subsequent discussions later in September 1983. He describes a discussion of the Cardiff and Bristol cases. And then if we go to it's October 1983. If we go to CBLA 0001755, please. So we're now in October 1983, and you'll see this document is the first meeting of the working group on AIDS in relation to blood transfusion. So that's a working group set up within the CBMLA. Again, I don't want to go through the detail of it, but we can see the bottom of the page, there's a discussion about the AIDS leaflet. Over the page, we see Dr. Lane in the second paragraph expressing a view about the AIDS, getting information to the public about AIDS. So he expressed the view that persons experienced in marketing or advertising would be able to give advice on getting the information to the public. Their methods may be more effective. We can then see there's a discussion, bottom half of the page, about surrogate testing. And then if we go over the page, we can see, bottom half of the page, there's a heading, use of plasma pools containing smaller numbers of donors. And Dr. Lane essentially updated the working party on investigations with respect of infectivity to non-A, non-B hepatitis with the use of pools of plasma containing donations obtained by apheresis. Preliminary results encouraging. And then next paragraph, if one could extrapolate from results with respect to non-A, non-B hepatitis to those which may be expected for AIDS, the concept of small donor pool material with a group of donors where there was a greater chance to obtain more information might have considerable advantages. It was noted, however, that this would, if implemented, require a reconsideration of plasma supply for self-sufficiency in blood products. So there is there then, notwithstanding what Dr. Lane said earlier in the draft proof, a further discussion of the possibility of using smaller pools, both in terms of non-A, non-B hepatitis, infectivity and AIDS.
But this is a slightly different, smaller pool, though, isn't it?
Yes.
Because this is a smaller pool of the donors themselves, as opposed to a smaller pool of what they donate.
Yes. I'm just trying to find the reference in his witness statement. It's page 291, but I don't think it... Yeah, if we go back to the draft proof of evidence, Sully, CBLA 605_002. Page 292. So this is Dr. Lane's observations in paragraph 667 to 668. So he refers to the use of the small pools. And this, again, appears to be a reference to what Dr. Smith described in his evidence about the restricted panel pools, the green 4 plasmapheresis donations. And then he describes the experiment starting well but finishing rather badly. And then the next paragraph, says, although the prevalence of HIV in the donor community was not known at this time, it was likely to be far less than non-A, non-B hepatitis. The use of smaller pool product was thought to offer some theoretical advantage to infrequent users of product, although the effect would be negated in heavy users. So that's Dr. Lane's take on what was being discussed at those minutes. I don't think there's really anything else from 1984 or 1985 that I need to draw your attention to in his statement. Essentially, the remainder, or the focus of the discussion then in the course of 1984 and 1985 is on heat treatment. And then Dr. Lane does describe developments in relation to the HIV screening test. He was present at various meetings in that regard, but obviously that wasn't itself part of the responsibility of BPL. So if we pick matters up on page 315 of this document, paragraph 717 is Dr. Lane's overview of 1984. He says one can see the year began with continuing uncertainty as to the causative agent of AIDS. In the spring, this was positively identified as a virus originally called HTLV3 or LAV. Heat treatment was potentially the answer. This resulted in our pressing forward with our heat-treated programme. He explains from the start of 85, some non-heat-treated product was available, but only on specific requests from an informed clinician. With the identification of the HIV virus, attention very quickly turned to the question of testing. This is particularly apparent from various meetings which took place during the second half of 1984. And then he says the documentation in 85 reveals that aside from the introduction of heat-treated product, most of the discussion of AIDS centred upon the development and then the introduction of a test in the UK. And if we go over the page, you can see that the draft proof of evidence then turns to that topic. I'm just going to give you the paragraph references in relation to that issue. It's 316, sorry, page references 316 through to 372. Dr. Lane does discuss in that part of his statement the consideration given to surrogate testing for HIV. But his statement makes clear that was not an issue in which he was particularly directly or intimately involved himself. But he does set out some of the meetings at which the issue was discussed. If we just look at yes, page 340. Just before I draw your attention to two paragraphs here, you'll recall that we looked at some of the Department of Health decision-making late 1984, early 1985, including the memorandum which Lord Clark gave evidence about from January 1985. Do we need, essentially posing a question, do we need heat treatment and screening? And we can see that foreshadowed in a letter that Dr. Harris from the Department of Health wrote to Dr. Lane, which is referred to in paragraph 762, where Dr. Harris says in the third line, as far as your proposal to heat treat Factor VIII is concerned, I would hope that you would bring this to the attention of the advisory group, who might wish to consider if the evidence for inactivation of HTLV3 by heat is sufficient to warrant taking this step, particularly if a screening test can be made available. There may also be implications for the adequacy of the proposed plasma supply if heat treatment affects the yield. I trust you'll furnish both the department and the CBA with full details. And then Dr. Lane's comment on that in the next paragraph. I must say this was a very unusual letter to receive, given that we were so advanced with our heat treatment work, which Dr. Harris was well aware of, because he was a member of the CBLA. So the written presentation note flags up a number of the particular meetings or documents of note that Dr. Lane refers to, and so I won't duplicate any of that. Just indicate to you where you will find in the statement Dr. Lane's overall conclusions on behalf of the CPLA in response to the allegations made in the statement of claim. It's at page 373. So it's headed Summary of AIDS/AIDS Risk Claims and Screening of Donors and Testing for HIV. And then Dr. Lane sets out the particulars of negligence or breach of statutory duty which had been pleaded against the CBLA by the plaintiffs, and sets out his response. Again, much of the response turns on the fact, if we just go further down the page, please, Sally, that the CBLA only became responsible for these matters on the 1st of December 1982. He asserts about 5 lines down into that paragraph, the CBLA pressed forward with its research into inactivation of viruses and using heat treatment and development of processes to be applied to factor 8 and 9 concentrates in the light of scientific information, confident that it would be a solution to the HIV problem, as events subsequently showed. For reasons I've touched on above, the alternative of small pools of manufacture would not have been practicable and in any event would not have offered total protection against HIV, given that we were only in a position to provide a proportion of the factor rate required for the treatment of haemophiliacs in England and Wales. We were committed to the research we were carrying out on heat treatment, and by the time HIV was identified and found to be heat labile, we were poised to introduce a new high-purity concentrate which was extremely tolerant to heat treatment. And in the interim, stop the next page. Page 374. We acted by making available the existing intermediate product in a heat-treated form in replacement of non-heat-treated factor 8. So that's the summary that Dr. Lane provides of the CBLA/BPL position in response to the allegations. He continues to develop some of these points over the pages, but we've looked over the next few pages, but we've looked at the main parts of his statement. If we just go to page 379, you'll see the heading Screening of Donors, and he responds there to allegations made in the main statement of claim against the CBLA in relation to the issue of screening of donors. I don't propose to go through the detail of that, but amongst other things, he makes the point that that wasn't the CBLA's responsibility. It was the responsibility of regional health authorities, regional transfusion centres and the Department of Health. If we then go to page 385, we see the final section of Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence is concerned with heat treatment. And this section continues until the end of the draft proof of evidence. So it runs from page 385 to page 484. We've already examined, through Dr. Smith's evidence, the specific developments in relation to viral inactivation and heat treatment. So there aren't any particular passages that I want to take you to. All I want to do is just read a couple of passages from the overview. So if we go to the following page, page 386, paragraph 842 sets out this. It may be suggested that, notwithstanding the way in which hepatitis B was effectively controlled, thought might have been given to viral inactivation of product during the 1970s, and more particularly when, towards the end of the 1970s, knowledge of the existence of non-A, non-B hepatitis had reached the point where it could be said that infection was virtually inevitable the moment a patient was treated with concentrate for the first time, whether commercial or NHS. So that's the suggestion or allegation to which Dr. Lane is then responding. And at paragraph 843, he says this: there are a number of answers to this. In the case of cryoprecipitant early concentrates, it was believed that the instability of the factor 8 would cause major problems if further process modifications were introduced. And he sets out a number of other matters in support of that view. And then the last sentence of paragraph 843, he says, secondly, the economics of factor VIII yield required that best use was made of the plasma source available at that time, since the price benefits linked to the purer products made by the industry were not then relevant to the blood transfusion service. Paragraph 844, he asserts that early consideration was given in 1982, following the first confirmed reports that non-A, non-B hepatitis, whilst not responsible for an acute severe illness, did after some years and in a significant number of patients cause chronic liver disease. So that appears to be an acceptance by Dr. Lane that that was confirmed by 1982. He doesn't there specify the particular reports that he is relying upon. And you will no doubt in due course wish to consider whether it's correct to say that early consideration was given to viral inactivation methods following those first confirmed reports. Paragraph 845, he describes the first action being to review all the likely virus inactivation methods, and he refers to Dr. Smith's statement in that regard. Paragraph 846, he says, advent of HIV and the rapidly clearing picture with regard to the nature of the source of the infection during the latter part of 83 and into 84 gave considerable impetus to our research and development work. And then he refers again to Dr. Smith's statement. And then 847, the policy of the transfusion service and the DOH was aimed at the maximum provision of factor VIII concentrates for the treatment of haemophiliacs, since it was considered that this represented the primary benefit to the patient, i.e. to arrest bleeding. So that's Dr. Lane's understanding of the objectives of the transfusion service and the Department of Health. Whilst it was understood that hepatitis B infection was a hazard of treatment, the risk-benefit ratio was clearly with the control of bleeding. And then picking it up, bottom of the page, it was only in the early 1980s when non-A, non-B hepatitis forms of hepatitis in their subacute and chronic phases were unacceptably common and potentially life-threatening, and because no means of donor exclusion were available, that attention had to be given to a process variation which would inactivate viruses in the finished product. The first record of a discussion at BPL on this matter is in 1981. Following the reports of Dr. Krusk and others in 1982, the national programme was put in hand. So that's the overview. It's then developed year by year in the rest of the statement, but that would be duplicating material that we've already looked at in Dr. Smith's evidence. And then if we just go finally to page 480, you will see there Dr. Lane's response to the allegations that were made in the litigation in relation to heat treatment. It effectively picks up upon what he set out in the overview and elsewhere in the statement. The statement finishes on page 484. Just go to that. So that's the end of the statement, unsigned, undated. You will see from the top of the page, it refers to draft number 4, dated 4th of October 1990. So this is the 5th draft proof of evidence, but it appears to essentially have married together two versions. But it's the fullest account from Dr. Lane that we have. So I've trespassed into what would normally be the break, but I wanted to finish that so that we can get a fresh start after the break with looking at Scotland and Northern Ireland. But that is a gallop through the evidence of Dr. Lane insofar as we have it in the form of that draft proof of evidence in the HIV haemophilia litigation.
Yes, well, thank you very much. We will start again at 5 to 12.
Thank you,
5
sir.
to 12.